this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In public life, Canadian Dr Winthrop Bell was a Harvard philosophy professor and wealthy businessman. As MI6 agent A12, he evaded gunfire and shook off pursuers to break open the emerging Nazi conspiracy in 1919 Berlin. His reports provided the first warnings of right-wing conspiracies in the German establishment that would eventually lead to Hitler and the National Socialists. In the 1930s, after reading Hitler's speeches and books, Bell was warning of the Holocaust, but his warnings fell on deaf ears until the outbreak of war. I'm Angus Wallace, and for this episode, I'm joined by Jason Bell. Jason is a professor of philosophy at the University of New Brunswick. He has served as a Fulbright Professor in Germany and was the first scholar granted exclusive access to Winthrop Bell's classified espionage papers. Jason is also the author of Cracking the Code, the untold story of Canada's greatest spy, which recounts Bell's story. But before we get started, I'd just like to take a moment to thank those of you who support the podcast. Those small contributions each month do help me to put time aside to produce the show. If you've not already done so, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Patreon allows listeners of the show to sign up and pay me a dollar or pound or whatever you want each month. For those that are patrons, I do try to give something back in the shape of extras, bits of podcasts that might have been left on the cutting room floor. So for the price of a posh cup of coffee, why not try to keep the show on air by heading over to patreon.com/WW2podcast. So, Jason, we're going to be looking at Winthrop Bell predominantly at the immediate end of the First World War and how he foresees what's to come in the 1930s, looking towards the Second World War and how he's not listened to. But let's start at the beginning. Who was Winthrop Bell, and what's his background?
Sure. So Winthrop Bell grew up in maritime Canada and was part of a prominent business family. His father made a whole lot of money, and he became skilled as part of the business trade, and then decided to go and engage in advanced studies. So he got a master's degree in history, and then a master's degree in philosophy, and then went to Germany after a stint as a railway surveyor in the wilds of northern Canada. He was helping to cut trees and things like this to develop the Great Canadian Railway. It was a hard life, and he decided he preferred the academic life. So he went to Germany to study with, eventually he came to study with Edmund Husserl, who is the founder of phenomenology. So he was smack dab in the middle of Germany in a university town called Göttingen. When World War I broke out, he was interned as an enemy citizen, spent 4 years in various prison camps in Germany, gets out of prison, goes back to England, and is recruited into the British Secret Service by Prime Minister Robert Borden of Canada. It's kind of the quick story.
The fag packet story. Well, I tell you what, he would go back. Did he actually know German before he went? That was one of my questions. So did he actually because he wanted to do his PhD in Germany, didn't he? So did he learn German to do his PhD in Germany?
He knew German earlier, so he had studied German in Canada. I've looked at his papers as he goes on. So at the beginning, when he first starts, his German it's quite good, but it's nowhere near fluent. So he makes a lot of mistakes. You go over time, and by 1913 or 1914, he's become pretty near fluent. So by that point, he makes tiny little grammatical errors, but it's much better. So yeah, he did know German before he went to Germany, and it was competent enough to listen to lectures and write papers and things like that.
I was fascinated about how difficult that must be, essentially, to sort of arrive in a country in a second language. It's not even your natural second language from home. It's one thing if one of your parents is German, but having to force yourself to teach it and then studying a different language at a PhD level is kind of hard work. On top of your academic work.
That's right. And the place he went to, and it's actually the legacy remains. So Göttingen, the University of Göttingen, was founded by the British King George II. So Niedersachsen was part of his kingdom. So the King George II was totally fluent in German. His children, they kind of knew German, they kind of didn't. So this became the place, and it's now regarded as being the best university in Germany for learning German as a second language. But it goes back to King George II. So I actually was a student there as an undergraduate. And this is kind of what brought me into the whole project quite accidentally. But my university happened to have an exchange program with Göttingen. And you go there and they really cultivate this Anglophone identity. And they don't really think about where it comes from, but it's just sheer habit. This is King George II's grandchildren needed to learn German, and so that became, you'd send them to the center of Germany, and they had the apparatus set up. But people like J.P. Morgan studied there, and just a lot of the great American Harvard philosophers went there. It was kind of the place to go, and so Winthrop was in this environment that was extremely friendly to the British viewpoint, and that was kind of how he got caught up in and arrested during World War I. His friends were, looking towards Britain for their clues, and they were estranged from Prussian militarism. They were much friendlier to the British Crown, and they were managing to convince him there was no way the war was going to happen. People were far too smart to do this.
You'll be fine. I was intrigued as well by his internment, because it's not something. I mean, internment of Germans in Britain never gets talked about, and certainly, I can't think of anything. It's possibly the only thing I've ever read about internment of Allied people in Germany. So, what's it like to be interned as a civilian in Germany? Because you're not technically a prisoner of war like a soldier.
So the military camps kind of go the military prison camps go a couple different directions. And so where the British soldiers were being housed, it sounds like it was oftentimes a really miserable experience, and a lot of violations of the Geneva Conventions and people getting beaten up and things like this. So Ruhleben, where Winthrop Bell was housed, sort of started off like this. It was kind of a brutal place. Guards would beat up prisoners kind of randomly. But early in 1915, things started to change. So basically what happened was a lot of kind of British people who were in Germany for various purposes, business purposes or diplomatic purposes. They weren't official diplomats. The official diplomats did get out of the country, but people who don't have that protection, they get arrested. Rich people get arrested. There were a lot of artists, musicians, athletes who get arrested. So they had all kinds of organizational and cultural talents, and they managed to convince the powers that be at the camp to let themselves organize the camp life, and the guards let them do it, and they figured out ways to profit from the camp economy. So Ruhleben is really a different story. They had their own theater. They had both for drama, and they had a movie theater, and they had orchestra, and they had musical theater, and they had a university, and all kinds of amazing things. It organically started because the prisoners wanted to do it this way, and some of them had a lot of money to sponsor these things. And then the guards were enthusiastic about it because they found ways to profit from the camp economy. So they could, they would smuggle things in that would get sold to the prisoners, for instance. It became something like a showpiece. So they would bring the Red Cross there, and they would bring the press there to sort of give the impression to the world that this is what it looked like, to be a prisoner. And it was not German propaganda originally. In other words, it was not a showpiece. It was authentically the prisoners who did it, but the powers that be found a way to profit from the image. So for Winthrop Bell, it was he had full days, so he would be playing sports, and he would be playing field hockey and giving lectures and attending theater, and he would be producing the stage scenery for the theater, and then being as enthusiastic as one could be in the situation. There was also a lot of blues and depression. You're stuck in this tiny little area with only men all the time, and and the same character. So they made the best of it, but it still sounds like it was not a pleasant experience, and people did not want to stick around there once the war ended.
No, it's slightly surreal. Now, my feeling was it might be an odd mixture of people, because once I started thinking about it, I thought, I wonder if the people who are over there are almost like him, students, better off people, businessmen. Actually, there's sort of a class thing to it from the people who are there because they're in Germany because of the money. They've got money, and that's why they've accidentally been caught up there.
That's exactly right. But the other part of it was there were a lot of sailors who were arrested at the outbreak of the war. So they were in the various ports, and that's really what made the camp go. So the rich people would decide we want X, we want a theater or whatever, and then the sailors would be hired to do it. There were carpenters there, and they could throw together these buildings, and they were, under the circumstances, they were really it was a handsome setup. But they we need something, we need a YMCA here, and the prisoners would raise the money and send out letters to home to get an additional fund sent to them, and then they would hire the people who did these things on ships, and they said absolutely. So the camp over time kept on improving and improving and improving. So they get better facilities, they get plumbing set up. If you absolutely had to be imprisoned, it was a pretty sweet setup.
It's fascinating because it's an area that never really gets talked about. But so he's recruited back to Britain randomly. I don't know if randomly or not. He finds himself in North Yorkshire, Ripon, near me. Which of all the places to come to, why would I get to Ripon and not say London, which, if you've got wealth, might be the place to go to?
It's hard to know exactly. So Ripon was General Maxwell's command, and General Maxwell was one of the early enthusiastic supporters of the organization that became known as MI6. So he and Mansfield Smith Cumming worked together. So this was at a point where, intentionally it makes sense. So there was very little MI6 penetration into Germany at this point. So MI6 had been running its operations largely out of Belgium and France. It was hard to have agents in Germany at this point, or to recruit in Germany. But after the war, there was a lot of nervousness about Germany. And so there at Ruhleben, there were these exceptionally smart people who knew the German situation well. So they get carted off to Camp Ripon, and basically interviewed there, and to see who knew things down the line. And it's hard, of course, to trace this out exactly, but there were a lot of MI6 agents and prominent MI6 agents who come out of Ruhleben. Part of this has to do with the fact that they became very culturally keen and linguistically keen on German during those years, but also there was that kind of sorting procedure at Camp Ripon where they were able to make these connections with British military intelligence, start work for MI6 at that point. A lot of times we think of World War I now as kind of just neatly ending in November of 1918, but at the time there was this thought that the Allies could need to march in again at any moment to combat Bolshevism. This real thought that the war could just break out again at any possible moment. And so I think these Ruhleben prisoners were being interviewed, or Ruhleben ex-prisoners at that point were being interviewed to see how they could help out in this battle or coming war.
When he's fingered for MI6, how do MI6 at this period go around recruiting people? Because it's always a slight mystery how people find themselves in MI6. Was it literally because he's been in the camp and someone had put a word in for him?
It was a funny story. So MI6 at that moment was dead broke, and they weren't able to recruit anybody. Mansfield Smith Cumming at that moment was actively laying off agents, and this was really depressing for him because these were people who had done dangerous work. But that was the post-war reality. So Winthrop Bell was able to slip in. So there was obviously the fact that he was competent, but that wasn't enough when MI6 was broke and having its government allotment decreased. Winthrop Bell's father was friends with the Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden. They were both Nova Scotians, both active in the business world. And so Robert Borden knew Winthrop Bell. And so there was a chance meeting between Winthrop Bell and Robert Borden in London in early December of 1918. At Ripon, Winthrop Bell had talked with these British officers and obviously impressed them, but that would not have been enough because there was no money to do anything other than to talk at this point. But Winthrop Bell impressed Robert Borden, and Canada did have money. So basically, Robert Borden offered to sponsor Winthrop Bell and set up the meetings. So Winthrop had met with Hankey independently and obviously impressed Hankey, but Robert Borden set up a lot of these meetings with other people and basically offered to pay Winthrop Bell's salary. So Winthrop Bell's MI6 salary came from Canada, routed through the Bank of Montreal. MI6 ended up paying his expenses, which was an impressive amount. This was him running around Germany for a long while, staying in pretty decent hotels. And telegram expenses were nothing to be sneezed at in those days, so that was an expensive pile of money. So MI6 paid this. It was an impressive outlay at a point where we nowadays think of the security agencies having all the money in the world, but back then it was a very different thing. They were at this moment, Mansfield Smith Cumming was needing to pack up and move his headquarters because it was too expensive, and they needed to find cheaper digs.
Did he get agent training? I mean, we all think of James Bond and secret writing and these kind of espionage tricks. Did they get agent training?
They did. So his diary records him meeting with principal intelligence figures like Tinsley before he goes into Germany. And you can see the way that his writing becomes molded. So you can see the agent training kind of intentionally. So Michael Smith has done some really good work on this to discover these training documents on basically what agents needed to report. And you can see Winthrop Bell's kind of in live time, the way that his writing becomes adapted to that model. Yeah, exactly, and precisely what that amounted to. Secret messages and how to write, in secret ink and the rest of it. It remains a bit of a mystery. Winthrop Bell did not carry a weapon into Germany, but the pattern of what counts as intelligence and what MI6 needed to know in order for this to be valuable, you can certainly see he was trained in that. And then really how to get messages out of the country. So this was tricky business. So there was a way that he had to communicate. So everything he was writing in the early part of 1919 from Berlin had to go through the public telegraph office. So there was an art to being able to say just enough. And then if MI6 was curious about things, they could send people in from Paris to talk to him in person. But that would be, for instance, the names of people. So he in early 1919, by public telegraph, he would just say, I know these prominent people who have this thing set up. And then you would find him, going on these mysterious meetings. And that's when he would be able to reveal the names. Later on, when the British military mission was set up in Berlin, he was able to be more frank with names. So he was able to reveal the people he was talking to. But there was obviously this danger of people getting arrested or shot, and he had to be cognizant of this. And I think of this a lot nowadays when hackers get into the system and they find the names and so forth and so on. And I think MI6 was probably a bit smarter about this back 100 some years ago than they've gotten. Computers can make people lazy.
See, he's sent as a Reuters reporter as his cover story, isn't it? So, I mean, for those people who aren't aware, what is Berlin like he arrives in early 1919, I think, doesn't he? What was Berlin like?
So it was a really kind of a tale of a couple of different cities. So in the inner part of the city, there's a lively nightlife and there's good food that people are eating, at least compared to a lot of the rest of Germany. And so a lot of this is a facade, really. So Winthrop Bell's going into these hotels where they have black market things. And really what they're doing is serving horse meat. But it's, compared to starvation, it was impressive. And of course, the horse meat is being advertised as the finest beef out of France and things like this. So this is people who were really rich war profiteers. They weren't starving. They weren't living handsomely at this point. But there were places you could get alcohol and so on. But you go out of that inner city district and then it becomes absolute desperate starvation very quickly. So Winthrop Bell is seeing both sides of this. So among his sources are the leftist labor organizers who are in Berlin but outside of the tourist district. And there you're dealing with absolutely desperate people and people literally starving to death. And then he's in the inner city and he's eating in these restaurants, and he's not too happy about this early 1919. Again, he's getting served this kind of makeshift meat, but surrounded by the equivalent of modern billionaires who are war profiteers. And he's kind of finds this disgusting that people are kind of living it up while other people are starving. So it was a dangerous, hopeful time. The mass of people in early 1919 were desperately hungry, but politically they were extremely optimistic. So they thought they were going to finally get British-style democracy, and they were, in a way, thrilled that they'd been defeated. So they'd been living under the heel of these Prussian militarists and been, absolutely suffering all kinds of privation during the war. So they're starving, but they can see the war profiteers living it up and getting richer and richer and richer. So that there's this crisis of confidence in the German militarist system, and they look abroad to Britain and absolutely become smitten with the British example. And these are the reports that Winthrop Bell's sending back to London is, these people love us and they love our way of democracy and they want to be like us. And so he sees the two sides of it. There's a deep political idealism connected with this absolute physical desperation. And as the desperation continues and they see that they're not being helped, this cynicism and despair sets in. And this is the tone of Winthrop Bell's early warnings in 1919. We cannot let this moment pass. And he's doing everything in his power to kindle that pro-democratic movement, just to keep it alive, so that the bad people don't take over again.
There is considerable unrest, isn't there? There's the Freikorps and these other groups start literally fighting in the streets. Does Bell see all this as a threat? Is MI6 even interested in this stuff, which I assume Bell's feeding back?
Yeah. So this is was absolutely the story. So immediately after the armistice, the war continues and it just shifts to northern Russia. So British troops and British ships are fighting in northern Russia. And there's this real paranoia and panic that this Russian communist revolution is going to sweep through the rest of Europe and eventually Britain is going to fall. So the battles don't stop. And Winthrop's initial mission really is to figure out what's going to happen. Can these militarists get themselves into a position where the war will need to start again? British kept up with the garrisons and war preparations. So the war preparations going on right through 1919 to invade Germany if need be. And there were a lot of people who thought it was going to happen or could happen at any moment. So that was really the ultimate upshot of his mission, was to be providing this military intelligence about how this could happen. And so his reports, as opposed to the rest of other military intelligence reports that were coming out, he was the only one who was really properly nervous about the right-wing movement. The rest of the military intelligence reports coming out were really nervous about the left-wing movements. By contrast, so Winthrop saw the left-wingers as being weak in Germany, that they didn't have a lot of upside potential. He thought if the starvation conditions continued, they could become dangerous. But Bell knew, and part of this was because kind of the race rhetoric he'd seen during the war. He saw that certain leaders in the German military had fought World War I as a race war. He was nervous about those people all along, including in his first meetings with British intelligence in late 1918, and warned them that some of the powers that be in Germany had thought of World War I as a race war. And after the war, these race warriors were discredited, but they remained intact, and a lot of their organizations remained intact. And so he kept his eye on them. And in the beginning of his reports, he said, well, they exist, but they're a discredited force. They're basically powerless.
Is that militaristically discredited or ideologically discredited?
Both. So politically, they were on the outs. Militarily, the pro-democratic officers in December of 1918, January of 1919 were also pro-democratic. So Winthrop Bell was friends with a lot of these pro-democratic officers. And at that moment, they were in charge. The militarists, or the racist militarists, were scattered. By April of 1919, Winthrop was warning that these people were now in the most powerful position in Germany. So by the end of April 1919, there was a struggle, he said, that was going to be decided by the end of April about whether the left-wing or the right-wing anti-democrats would be on top. By the end of April 1919, this had been settled in favor of the right-wing militarists. But at this point, they were far stronger than German democracy. And he was warning MI6 that they could take over the country anytime they wanted. They just didn't want to, because things were so shabby. And so there's kind of a standard historical narrative that Weimar Germany was really a thing, and it was powerful, and eventually its credibility becomes undermined. But according to Winthrop Bell's reports, Weimar Germany was shot basically by the end of April 1919, at least in terms of internal power. He still thought it could be saved if there was a rescue package that came from abroad. But failing that rescue package, the militarists were in charge by the end of April 1919.
It's interesting. I assume that the Allies were less concerned about the right wing because they're fighting the left wing in Russia, so they don't want another Bolshevik revolution in Germany. So it's easier to stomach right wing extremism in Germany.
There are parallel stories about this. And I think if Winthrop Bell had not been there, I think the right wing would have really snookered the British politicians entirely. So these right wingers knew exactly what the British wanted to hear, what the British aristocrats wanted to hear, which was that they were going to be a reliable force to fight communism. And under that cover, they had already done a tremendous amount of damage in Eastern Europe. So the British had handed over policing authority to these German right-wingers in Latvia. And these German right-wingers were supporting Ukrainian, basically it was a full-blown genocide. So there were something like 100,000 Jews that were killed in 1918, 1919 in Ukraine. A lot of this was unwittingly funded by the British government. So they were paying these right-wingers. It was unwitting. They, of course, these Germanic troops were not telling them what they were doing, but the official story that they were telling the British was, well, this is to fight communism. And you can see Churchill kind of finally opening up his eyes that these were anti-Jewish attacks that were going on. But Winthrop is advising people like Churchill about the real nature of the story, and you can see eyes opening at the same time and warnings that were being issued to the right-wing movement. And the British demand that the Germans leave Latvia and things like this by mid to late 1919. A lot of that was based on Winthrop Bell's intelligence. But there's a parallel story, and I tell it in the book, of this Ludendorff right-wing anti-Jewish German movement that corners some British officers. Colonel Ryan is one of them, and wants the British to support a coup that the right-wingers are going to put on in Germany to throw out democracy and get rid of communism once and for all. And Colonel Ryan's sympathetic to this. And General Neil Malcolm, who Winthrop Bell consulted with frequently, had kind of an ear for it. So you could see that he was sympathetic to that kind of right-wing reasoning. But Winthrop Bell was there to talk him out of it. So the plan gets shot down by some of the brass hats. But if Winthrop Bell had not been there, one could imagine it would have very easily gone through. And this was a well-organized plan to take over Eastern Europe and to slaughter a lot of Jews. So this is kind of one of the surprising things I learned in the course of writing this book is just how committed the German right-wingers were to genocide. The German forces were defeated almost completely in their adventures. But if they had not been defeated there, and a lot of this was because of Winthrop Bell's intelligence, there could have been millions dead. And this is what the New York Times was warning in 1919, is that millions of Jews would perish or would be murdered if this movement were not defeated. So this kind of shocking, almost forgotten part of history that there were these genocides going on, obviously overshadowed by what happened during World War II. But World War II was a replay of what Ludendorff had attempted but failed to accomplish in 1919.
Bell draws these anti-Semitic currents, or sees these anti-Semitic currents in Germany throughout the First World War, doesn't he? What evidence what's he spotting throughout from 1914 that they're pulling together in 1919?
What he tells Robert Borden in December 1918, and then Robert Borden asked him to write this up and send it to the War Cabinet. But Winthrop Bell tells Borden and then writes for the War Cabinet that what Britain doesn't realize is that for a lot of prominent Germans, the war that was just fought was a race war against the Slavs. And so that was their first enemy was the Slavic people. And then it looks like they added Jews to the list in 1915. And that's when they decided to have the concerted campaign against the Jews. This was not Winthrop's discovery. This was Frankfurt, the Jewish newspaper, discovered a secret letter. So the Frankfurt Jewish newspaper, I think it was called the Jüdische Rundschau, discovers in 1917 a secret letter produced by this military plot in Germany, 1915, that declares that after the end of the current war, no matter which way it went, they were going to fight another war and they were going to target the Jews as their enemy. Why did this happen? I think it was because Ludendorff realized that he couldn't get his way on winning his race war against the Slavs right away. There were just too many of them. So he needed to basically pick a smaller enemy first. So how did Winthrop Bell know about this? He doesn't say in his report to Borden or his report to the War Cabinet, but he was in prison in Berlin and dealing with these Prussian guards, and I'm sure regularly hearing this kind of racial abuse. There was a significant Jewish contingent at Ruhleben, and I'm sure he would have been hearing racial abuse directed against them, and that would have struck his ear as very funny because it would have been very foreign from the very liberal spirit he was experiencing at Göttingen. But he was also reading constantly, so he was reading all the newspapers, and he's getting them in Ruhleben, so he's reading the right-wing newspapers, the centrist newspapers, the left-wing newspapers. And through the war, these right-wing newspapers were beginning to sort of openly advertise this kind of race-baiting conspiracy, and it began to appear in academic publications and things like this. So it was already well organized in a way, and then what Hitler and people like Ludendorff can appeal to is a much older history of this, of war going back to the Kaisers that was directed at subsuming the Slavic peoples, and occasionally this would evolve into racial murders, into local exterminations, going back hundreds of years. And then, eventually Adolf Hitler in his Mein Kampf says, well, that's just the right way to do this fighting. Instead of making these things occasional, we need to make them permanent. Winthrop Bell was trained as a historian, but he also had this kind of first person emotional experience of seeing, people who really believed these things. So it wasn't just theoretical for him. He was, able to detect these arguments and see how the arguments actually had these practical effects and the way that people were being treated. But that's kind of the initial revelation of his report is there were powerful people in Germany who were conceiving of the war as a race war. And those people are not gone. They remained well organized, not popular at this point, and not even popular in the military, but they were influential people.
It does feed this back to it's called Paris, isn't it? For where the peace negotiations are underway. Presumably, he makes all this in his report to them. How are his ideas received there? Because he has ideas on how to sort of counteract the right wing as well, doesn't he?
He does. So it's sort of an interesting and tragic story. I don't get into this tremendously a lot in the book. A lot of this, I think, hinges around Woodrow Wilson's April illness. Wilson comes in and he's the real idealist, and he wants to treat Germany well, and he wants to get food supplies in there. And then the British and the French resolutely block this. They want to punish Germany, make them pay. Winthrop Bell goes into Paris and personally briefs David Lloyd George and convinces David Lloyd George to liberalize. But at this moment, President Wilson comes down with the Spanish flu, and some scholars think he suffers a stroke at this time and just totally loses the thread. So he comes in as a real kind of a liberal warrior in the early part of 1919. But by April 1919, he's just being pushed around by the French, who are looking for a punishing peace. So Winthrop Bell manages to convince David Lloyd George just at the moment Wilson is lost. So the vote remains 1-2, really. Italy didn't really have much of a vote. America's the liberalizing vote early, and then it becomes Britain later on. But David Lloyd George really does look like he was convinced by Bell's arguments that Bell had this 4-point program, meets with David Lloyd George. The next day, David Lloyd George is point for point advancing this program. He only has one vote, but he has a powerful veto, which he says that if the other powers refuse to go along with this, he will refuse to let British troops invade Germany. And with that threat, he manages to make a lot of this liberalization that Winthrop Bell wanted happen, which really meant breaking the food blockade, letting food get in, and beginning to respect the German democratic government. Basically what happens, and David Lloyd George gets a bad rap for this, but what you see him doing in Paris is really trying to push the case, but he just couldn't do this single-handedly. And by the time he was able to push the case, Wilson was out of the ball game, and it was doing what the French wanted. But still, food gets through to Germany, and possibly hundreds of thousands of lives are saved. Versus if the blockade had continued, 750,000 Germans had died in the food blockade. A couple 100,000 of those happened after the armistice is signed. Winthrop is telling David Lloyd George in the spring of 1919 that the starvation situation is about to turn cataclysmic. Millions could have died if the food blockade were not lifted. Winston Churchill advances this case in Parliament. Winthrop Bell advances it in the press, and this gives David Lloyd George the cover to go to the meeting of the Big Four and demand the lifting of the food blockade. Initially, France and America don't want to do it, but David Lloyd George just absolutely browbeats them that if this does not happen, then we're not going to help you if you want to invade. And then that's when the French kind of throw up their hands and say, fine, you can let food get through. So it's a funny story of compromises that happened. Winthrop Bell got about a quarter of what he was looking for, maybe a half. I'm not really sure how to count it in terms of kind of liberalizing the situation. And it was enough to give German democracy breathing space for a little while. What
fascinated me is that whilst he's a secret agent, his cover story is obviously working for Reuters. So he's actually able to feed back into the press, into the public sphere, ideas. Can he use that to circumvent some of his ideas that he was sending to the Foreign Office, or does it not work like that?
I think the answer is yes. So you find things that, Mansfield, Smith, Cumming, and MI6 obviously had their own kind of route to getting these things published. And so things were getting blocked by the Foreign Office that ended up finding their way in the press at any rate. And so basically this comes into play in Winthrop Bell's final report of December 1919. It's blocked by the Foreign Office. So MI6 and Winthrop Bell both want it to be declassified and published as a book with Stanley Unwin and Stanley Unwin's game. If he has the sign off on this, the Foreign Office blocks that and it's classified, but Winthrop Bell's reports still show up in the newspapers. And that's because MI6 had its own route to getting these things published. So there was, Foreign Office obviously had the sign-off authority on a book appearing with an author's name on it. But Winthrop Bell's reports were appearing anonymously. Really would have been fascinated about, and I've been talking with people who do intelligence studies nowadays, just like what this relationship is between the intelligence bureaus and the press. But you find, for instance, the British press outside of the left wing, so they were always a different story, but the kind of the centrist press was echoing David Lloyd George's line on making the Germans pay and advancing this notion that the Germans were very rich and well fed, and they could really generously pay reparations. When Winthrop Bell convinces David Lloyd George that this was not the case and that an attempt to impose serious reparations on them would be destabilizing, David Lloyd George is convinced, and then the next day, the centrist British newspapers changed their tune. So it's just interesting to see how that kind of secret intelligence and then the names that go with the faces, the people who can speak publicly with Churchill and David Lloyd George, and then the press, they kind of all go together. And within 24 hours, what MI6 knows can go to the press. And it didn't always work this way. There were certain secrets that Winthrop Bell told to MI6 that have remained secret ever since then. But there are other things that get converted to public knowledge, sometimes the same day. Sometimes he would send the Telegraph reports early in the morning, and then the British newspapers by the afternoon and the evening were running these reports.
He's concerned about there being potentially another war. He's concerned about these right-wing groups. But at the same time, I mean, you alluded to before about the country being war-weary and sick of war and it's starving. So how is he expecting to fight the next war if he's feeding back these reports?
So there's a couple of things going on. So one thing he says is, this is 1919, he says there's absolutely no chance that there could be another great war fought by the Germans right away because the current fighting age generation is so sick of it, which did not discount the possibility of there being the kinds of marauding forces that you found in Latvia and things like this. So there were hundreds of thousands of right-wing troops, mercenary troops who kind of had these, governmental connections. They could get weapons from the official stores. They were also funded by various industrialists and things like this. So this army was strong enough to fight against these new democracies and to win without, if Britain did not help them, basically. As Winthrop Bell said in 1919, these right-wing militarists saw that it was the idea of fighting the French or the British or the Americans directly was madness. So they weren't going to try to do that right away. But as of 1919, Winthrop Bell says these right-wingers knew this and they'd hit upon the strategy of propagandizing the next generation. So they were going to need to begin training the future youth. Bell said that it was happening in two ways. So one was you had the training of these adolescent soldiers. And Bell said that Britain needed to shut that down right away, this militia training of the youth. But then there was a propaganda effort that was going along in the schools to train them in this new ideology. So that had been something they didn't need to create this from nothing. This is what he said had been going on during World War I. The teachers in the German high schools and the universities, professors, many of them were these right-wing ideologues who were promoting this nationalist doctrine. So it was just simply a matter of maintaining that. But Winthrop Bell's warning in 1919 was that it would take a generation for these militarists to be in a position to fight another war. But it's clear that was their intention. And these were people who were playing a long game. They could cause all kinds of mischief in the short run. There were plenty of Jews and other ethnic minorities that they could target even before they were going to be able to target the big guns in the West. But that was clearly their intention.
He's almost foreshadowing the Hitler Youth, that's still 10, 15 years away, essentially.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So they were already in place. Hitler doesn't invent anything. Hitler was the hired help, but all of these organizations were in place before Hitler, and Hitler's hired into the movement. This movement has, by late 1919, says Winthrop Bell says that it already controls the majority of the German officers' corps, and it's weeding out the moderates. But Hitler is recruited into that organization first in a propaganda capacity, then in a military intelligence capacity. But you find him in his military intelligence reports, late 1919, echoing this race war ideology. And that's what's getting him promoted. So if he had been submitting these reports talking about getting rid of the Jews in Germany to the moderate officers, he would have been fired. And that's what would have happened in early 1919 when the moderates were in charge. But by late 1919, the moderates were getting cleared out, including really prominent people. So I spent a lot of time in the book with Achim von Arnim, who is one of Winthrop Bell's sources. So this is a wealthy German nobleman who had won Germany's top military honors. He comes from this notable military family that goes back centuries. He's part of the German general staff. And this guy's too big to fail until the Nazis eventually are able to push him out. So he and the other moderates get just pushed out of the army. And Winthrop Bell's watching this happening. So those are his sources, or the liberals and the moderates. And they're just getting weeded out of the army through the summer and the fall of 1919. And in Winthrop Bell's final report, December 1919, he says, this is now largely accomplished. The moderates are in a small minority now.
He's more or less prophesied what's to come. What is hard to get your head around is why he resigns from MI6 after kind of just over a year, when he's kind of seems to be actually nailing what's going to happen in the next 10, 15 years.
What happens, the door shuts on the liberalizers. I speculate in the book that this has to do with John Maynard Keynes's book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. You see that kind of reaction in a lot of different places. So James Headlam Morley, Keynes's book appears, and it really causes a scandal. The backlash puts the British conservatives in charge. So the part of this grand coalition, the liberals and David Lloyd George had a lot of authority, and they were kind of able to get their way on the ground. But this anti-Keynes backlash really shut the door on this. So David Lloyd George had been doing everything that he could to liberalize the peace terms. And there was this idea that even the Versailles Treaty, even though it looked very punishing, there were still ways that, Britain could cook the books, count things as, in-kind contributions and so on, to make it look to the public like they were really punishing Germany, even when they were, really going to be helping them out. But after Keynes's book appears, the conservatives really had the upper hand, and the whole liberalizing effort just gets shut down. So kind of the tragic end of the World War I story is that Winthrop Bell is he's kind of the co-chair of this commission that's going to be creating this rescue plan for Germany. So Headlam Morley is on the public side of this. Winthrop Bell is doing the private side of this. So he's talking to the finance. They set up this just stunning proposal, and they get the world's financiers involved in this. And people all throughout the world, including J.P. Morgan and Herbert Hoover and heads of prominent British banks and from the neutral countries, are willing to finance the recovery of Germany, the financial recovery of Germany, if the governments are willing to backstop this.
It's almost like the Marshall Plan that would come after the Second World War.
Exactly. This was the invention of it. What was this financial rescue plan? It was in all the newspapers, and what happened is Chamberlain, who was the head of the finance department in Britain, just shut it down and said there's absolutely no way we're going to support this. The basic worry was that this would empower the Americans, that British money would go to getting Germany money that would then go to buying American supplies. So the conservative powers that be wanted to get their empire back again, and they saw America as a threat to this. They weren't really thinking a whole lot about Germany at this point, of the awful tragedy of it.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with you in a moment. Welcome back. I'm talking to Jason Bell about Winthrop Bell. So he resigns in 1920. He essentially has an academic and a business career, but he returns to Germany in 1934, at which point he finds himself reflecting on, after dealing with his contacts, and you sort of touched upon this earlier about Mein Kampf. What I found interesting about this is, what is he saying in Mein Kampf that everybody else seems to be missing, and why is he the only person that's saying it?
I think there's two things going on here, and I'd alluded to this earlier about the 1919 race war stuff. He's trained as a historian, and he also has seen what this race hatred looks like up close. So he reads Mein Kampf, and he sees all these historical allusions of Hitler pointing his followers to these moments in history where these slaughters occur of racial enemies. So Hitler's pointing his followers to this happening in Carthage, where the Romans, of course, slaughter the inhabitants of Carthage. And then he's pointing them to these examples of the Germanic tribes during the Middle Ages doing this to the Slavs. Hitler saying, and that's good. This is the right way to fight. Winthrop Bell, who had seen this up close, so he saw Jews being targeted in the summer of 1919 in Germany, realized that this was not just academic theorists talking about history. This was Hitler actually thinking this was a good idea, a worthwhile plan. So I think it was those two things added together. It was historians' awareness and this emotional experience, seeing this up close. And I would say the third thing is his warnings about Hitler's Mein Kampf as being a plan for worldwide racial exterminations. He's looking at this as a logician. So this is one of the subjects that Winthrop Bell was teaching at Toronto and Harvard. He's teaching logic. And his point is that Hitler's making an argument, but he's never stating the conclusion of it. He's always just pointing it to it. So there's all these premises that are kind of vaguely pointing in a direction. And Bell says in his published warnings, it was because Hitler just could not come out and say what he meant. If he had said, I mean to exterminate all these people, he would have been, arrested and deposed. So he needed to say it just clearly enough so his followers would know what was going on. I think nowadays we call this, the dog whistles, but everybody else is going to remain relatively clueless about it. Hitler got good at it, being able to play that game. So the people who would be willing to join him in race murder understood what he was saying, and other people would think, well, he was kind of Hitler was kind of a, mean guy, but basically rational, and you could reason him back to the middle. And that's what the powers that be throughout the British democratic world thought, that before World War II started, that, Hitler was kind of a fascist in the Mussolini model, but you could reason with him and you could talk to him and get him back to this place of centrality. And Winthrop Bell alone in the world understood that in 1939 that this was an intractable plan, that Hitler's logic could only bring him to worldwide racial murders.
You mentioned he's writing and publishing about this. How does these articles go down? Before 1939, well, even after 1939, when is he publishing his warnings?
So we don't have a really clear record of what was being said in before 1939. We know that Winthrop Bell was regularly in contact with General Neil Malcolm, who was the head of Chatham House at this point, and was advising Malcolm basically to work on rearming. This is between 1934 and 1939. Was pushing the case that this was a real threat. Early 1939, the paper trail becomes clear about what was being said. So in the spring of 39, Winthrop Bell writes up a warning about Hitler's plan for worldwide racial exterminations. He meets with the Canadian agricultural minister, Gardiner, who during World War II left his agricultural post and took up a prominent military post. But then at the same time, he writes this up for the press, for the Canadian press, and meets with his brother, Ralph, who was a prominent figure who had all kinds of connections to the Canadian and the American governments. He'd helped actually set up a U.S. Air Force base in Halifax. So had these kind of impressive secret intelligence contacts for a businessman. So Ralph and Winthrop work up a list of trusted editors that they can send this to in early 1939 and send it out to these various newspapers. And then editors just refuse to believe it. that Hitler's planning racial exterminations. The other person that Winthrop sends this out to is he's somebody who becomes important in the foundation of the CIA, who worked with the U.S. State Department. Francis, I think his last name is Dayak. He was a friend of Winthrop's from Harvard, who wrote back later that year explicitly confirming that Winthrop's thesis was right, and it was confirmed by what was happening in Poland, which seems to indicate that there was a much earlier awareness of racial exterminations than has been credited even in the literature. 1942 is where you next see kind of documentary evidence and secret intelligence files that this was happening. But this letter indicates the U.S. State Department knew at least by the end of 39. At the spring of 39, editors refused to believe it. When the war broke out, people who had read it earlier, remembered it was on their desks, and then they found a publisher for it in Canada. So it was a prominent newspaper, quasi-official organ of the Liberal Party, which was running Canada at the time, called Saturday Night. And so this runs in a couple of prominent headlines in November and December of 1939, outlining Hitler's logic in Mein Kampf, this doctrine of racial poison, Hitler's ironclad belief that the rest of the world was conspiring to commit genocide against the German people, and Hitler's belief that they needed to do it first. They needed to exterminate these populations before they themselves were destroyed. And so Winthrop's warning was that Hitler planned to kill all the non-Aryans on Earth. So only Aryans were going to be permitted to live. And according to Hitler's doctrine of race poison, there simply could not be a drop of non-Aryan blood left on the Earth, or else Hitler thought that blood could eventually poison the German people and destroy it.
It seemed fantastical in 1939, such accusations. So is he reactivated during World War II? You know, he's a prominent Germanophile, German studier of German, whatever they are. What are you?
Yeah.
You know, Germanophile, Germanophile. What are you?
It's a funny story. So the day that the war breaks out, Winthrop writes to his contacts in Canada and Britain, and these were high-ranking people. So in Britain, it was Hankey and General Neil Malcolm, and then in Canada, he writes to Ralston. What happened basically is that Canada at this moment was in complete disarray, so they had virtually no military to speak of, and were totally in a panic and did not have their acts together. So a few months goes by, and Winthrop hears nothing, and then he is out hauling wood to bring into his house to chop, and falls down and cracks or breaks his tailbone, and is totally out of commission. And that's when Canada writes to him about taking up a post. So at this moment, he's totally incapacitated. Finally, a couple months later, he's in a position to go to Ottawa and has these mysterious meetings. He's writing back home to his wife, telling her that he's being approached to take up these mysterious posts. But at this point, he says no to them. So there is a shift in his thinking that happens between September, when he initially volunteers, and early 1940, when he's being recruited back into the service. My best guess is he's being recruited to lead the entire Canadian intelligence apparatus at this point.
He would seem a natural choice, wouldn't he?
He had the cultural abilities, but he's looking like an absolute prophet at this point as being the person who was warning against this. So he's brought by a government minister to the Rideau Club in Ottawa, and he writes back to his wife that cabinet minister after cabinet minister comes up and talks to him, and the Canadian press, leader of the Canadian Press Association, comes up and talks to him, and he writes to his wife like this had to have been prearranged. But he refuses the post. It's something of a mystery of why he did it, but we can kind of get a flavor of why he refused at this point, because he was just totally fed up with the bureaucracy of it. So this is what had shut down his reports in late 1919. It was, government bureaucrats who he had to have a signature to be able to get this published. A bureaucrat simply refused the signature. And the same thing was happening in early 1940. So one of the reasons that it was taking so long for the Canadian defense industry to get set up is there would be a huge, in today's terms, multi-billion-dollar industry that would need to be set up to produce aircraft. It would need a signature from some minister, and then that paper would be sitting in somebody's inbox and just not getting signed for weeks. And he just got fed up with it. He decided he wanted to do something a bit more practical. And so he basically gets a position set up just like he wants it. So it's there's a company that he's effectively running. So he's the secretary of it. And in these days, it means he's functionally the president. The president's off doing these kind of things, and Winthrop's running the company. But these companies are wholly owned by the Canadian taxpayer, but they're set up as private companies. So they're able to get things done with less red tape. And so this is what he wanted to do at this moment. He wanted to help create the Canadian war industry that would be, fighting the Germans. At this moment, I think the moment for intelligence, he thought, had kind of passed. You just needed to kind of, beat the Nazis at this moment on the battlefield. But as of September 1939, he was, ready to be parachuted into Europe if that's what the government had wanted him to do. So he volunteered to do absolutely anything that they wanted him to do. And he said he would be willing to work for either Britain or Canada. He had a slight preference for Canada at that point. He was kind of getting older at this point. I don't think he really wanted to go into Germany, but he would have absolutely done it if he'd been asked to do it.
It's fascinating as war breaks out, he chooses to wear his businessman's cap rather than his German experience in espionage cap. It's
a strange thing. I mean, he really was just absolutely disgusted with bureaucracy. And I talked to a lot of people in the kind of the intelligence scholarship industry who are formerly intelligence agents, and I kind of will quote Winthrop Bell, browbeating the bureaucrats, and you can see that they're kind of annoyed, but they also kind of see the justice of it. There's this paradoxical fact about being a government agent. You get to learn all these things, but you're not allowed to reveal them. And even if not revealing them is a terrible mistake, some bureaucrat has authority over you. And I think Winthrop was willing to play that game up until the stakes became ultimate. So given that he knew what he knew about what the Nazis were intending to do, he just did not any longer want to play this, waiting for a signature game. He wanted to, get to the business of fighting the Nazis right away. I tell the anecdote in the book. He has this, he has a dream that he reports that this is while he's working in the Canadian war industry, but he reports this dream where he's escaped from the Nazis in the Netherlands, and he gets onto a ship, and the Nazi agents are chasing him. I keep thinking that this is his subconscious realizing what would have happened if the Canadians had been willing to immediately accept his offer to be an intelligence agent and send him to the continent. He would have been doing that kind of thing in Western Europe. It would have put him on the front line at a dangerous moment. But one of the points I make in the book is even what he was doing in Canada in early 1939 was dangerous. So there were Gestapo agents who were active in North America. They'd already proven their willingness to murder dissidents abroad. And that's why when his warnings were going out in early 1939, it had to go out to people who could be trusted with secrets. He simply could not just write this to a random letter to the editor.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jason. Loyal listener, if you want to know more of Winthrop Bell, the book to pick up is Cracking the Nazi Code, The Untold Story of Canada's Greatest Spy. For patrons of the podcast, there is a bit more of Jason and I chatting, so hopefully that will help flesh out even more of Bell's story. If you are not a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/WW2podcasts. Well, that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.